Hello and welcome to Editor's Pick, a War Elephant podcast, episode number 25. My name is Ian, I'm one of your hosts, and I have with me Winston.
Here to talk about, I understand, deconstruction, which Ian uh, describes as when people apostatize from Christianity.
Yeah, it's called by a couple different names. The traditional name would be, as Winston mentioned, apostasy or falling away. That was a big one in the 20th century at least. But recently there's been a movement that calls the process deconstruction, and they describe themselves or identify as ex-evangelical or ex-evangelical. This is distinct from what I would call post-evangelical, because I think most post-evangelicals still claim to be Christians. These are people like Jory Micah, Greg Boyd, Rachel Held Evans before her tragic death. These would be people who still claim the name of Christianity, but often will agree with the political and philosophical stances of people who have left the faith. They just think that there's still value within the tradition. Now, to get our biases and positions out of the way, I am a current evangelical Christian from the Reformed Baptist denominations. Winston, share what you're
And I
comfortable sharing about your faith.
am a former evangelical and current agnostic leaning atheist who wasn't evangelical until when I was there, like 1920-ish, which would have been about 6, 7 years ago. And
Yeah,
currently, even while I don't have any active religious belief, I consider myself to share a lot of the basic values and worldview of evangelicalism.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to share this conversation with Winston is because we've had some really thoughtful conversations about it, and his approach really reminds me of the views of Douglas Murray and there's who's the historian Tom Holland, who both do not feel like they personally can believe in Christ or the Bible as literal or even symbolic truths that define our spiritual reality, but nonetheless share a great deal of sympathy and values with the more conservative Christian philosophy. And that's in distinct and sharp contrast to the phenomenon of deconstruction that I want to talk about today. This was really spurred on for me as a topic a week and a half ago when I was talking with my siblings. And we mentioned the middle son of our former pastor. We grew up in Minnesota going to John Piper's church. John Piper is a Baptist Calvinist theologian and pastor. He is retired from active pastoring but still writes many books. He has 4 sons and a daughter. The middle one is, I believe, Abraham, who is the founder of the blog 22 Words, which has grown into a multi-million-dollar business. And so Abraham Piper has an enormous following. In his youth, his teens and early 20s, Abraham was convinced that Christianity was false and wanted to be a rock star and lived a lifestyle of drinking, drugs, and women. In the early 2000s, he returned to the church for a while, I think about 10 years. He got married and had kids, reconciled with his father, and became part of the church. And I actually had some really good conversations with him about that and about his family. He and his family miscarried in the mid 2000s, I think before 2010. And that really started him on a process away from the church again. And at this point, my brother and I were talking, and he saw some videos from Christian or Christian adjacent YouTubers who had mentioned that Abraham Piper had become a TikToker. And what he specifically was getting a lot of attention for was this deconstruction, these extremely snide comments about core tenets of evangelical or Christian theology, and also evangelical practice, which of course is more open to criticism, since even a Christian will say, well, Christians are sinners and therefore will practice their faith wrongly and hurt people. So, have you ever come across this phenomenon of people who build a really strong following based on attacking Christianity specifically, Winston?
So I suppose the easiest way to answer that would be that he too then would call back to the 2000s when there was new wave atheism was a very big thing. And I'm sure you noticed a lot of it was about very scientistic, very rationalist, So people who are asserting that religion is bad and dumb because it's irrational and it doesn't have any hard physical evidence, and therefore you should become an atheist, and so on and so forth. I won't rehash the entire history of the culture wars of the Zero Zeros, but suffice to say they were very intimately tied towards fights such as over evolution and the teaching of religion in schools, and whether the government should use the word God anywhere in printing and printed materials, and something that had generally struck me about how the movement was first that it came after the big waves of de-Christianization in the late 20th century. They're almost totally irrelevant now, but they also achieved almost all of their political goals because the cultural force of Christianity declined quite a lot.
Well, the
So I'm sure
interesting thing is that some of them, of course, Christopher Hitchin has passed away, but he actually had some very interesting dialogues with prominent Christian pastors just before he died. I'm not at all saying that he changed his views or became a Christian in the end, but he had become perhaps less fiery in his hatred of Christianity near the end of his life. Richard Dawkins, perhaps the most famous of these new atheists, has recently been saying things like, I want to say Happy Christmas, even though Christmas is stupid and no one should believe in it. Like, this is something I don't think he would say. I mean, Richard Dawkins is famous for saying something like, Catholic children are so abused by being taught to be Catholics that sexual abuse by priests is minor compared to that problem. I mean, that was the level of his hatred for Christianity. And to see that change is fascinating to me. Sam Harris has also been willing to have dialogue and has become something of a Zen Buddhist, although still very atheist. So it's interesting that while we have this movement of ex-evangelicals, it's like the poison, the fight has come from within evangelicalism, whereas before, most of these people did not grow up Christian in the new atheist movement.
Right, so I think like something that I think probably most of our listeners would probably be interested in finding out. So what is driving the decline of Christianity in general? Is it people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens who simply successfully, for lack of a better word, evangelize a new doctrine of atheism, or are there other societal factors at work, and what does this mean for the future of society? Like, would you agree with that, Ian?
I am not sure. I do know that even within evangelicalism, people who stay Christian, or at least claim to stay Christian, I mean, it's difficult. One of the beliefs in my understanding of theology is that it's very difficult for us to say whether someone is saved because we don't know what's inside their heart and inside their head. So I want to make that distinction in case someone thinks that I am claiming knowledge of someone's true state. But I would say that I think, honestly, it has a lot more to do with a reaction to the culture of Christianity in the 90s and early 2000s, which was intensely legalistic. It was very rule-based. It was very powerful. Like, yes, the moral majority was declining, but, I think that the idea of the evangelical voter as a significant voting bloc that even Democrats had to appeal to try and get some swing voters from the middle, that's no longer relevant. Barack Obama was able to do that partly because of his race and mostly because of his race in two ways. I mean, the black community is very Christian. And so Barack Obama came from that and spoke in very pastorally tones sometimes. And that would be appealing to someone who was in a church context. He also, of course, was black, which meant that Christians who rightly looked at the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and all the civil rights and the failures of the evangelical and conservative church to reconcile with their African American brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, there was segregation in churches just as there was segregation in normal society, and the church feels rightly some guilt over that. And so, they want to be part of that healing because a good Christian will look at the Bible and say there is no Jew or Greek. Every tribe and tongue shall confess Christ, and think, yes, everyone is the child of God, and therefore we should work to reconcile with them. So I think that it's much more about a reaction to the negative aspects of evangelical practice than necessarily. So I think that it's really more about a reaction to evangelical practice, the legalism and the rigidity of evangelicalism, which of course got worse as we realized that religion was declining. Now, religion's been declining since the 50s. Ross Douthat wrote an excellent book called Bad Religion, where he tracks the height of the mini awakening, sort of like a great awakening from the 17 and 1800s. But there was a mini awakening in the 1950s with the rise of Billy Graham and the Campus Crusades and the parachurch organizations. There was a huge growth of churches. But of course, in the 60s, with the sexual revolution and the drugs and the hippies and the counterculture, that decreased rapidly. And we've been on a decline since then. We haven't, the 80s, unfortunately, for all their political conservatism, did not have a cultural conservatism. As you can see by the fact that 80s movies are known for their, very harsh content. A lot of nudity, a lot of drugs, a lot of sex, a lot of language that just doesn't reflect a cultural conservatism. The 90s were actually more of a conservative time, but they weren't culturally, but they weren't a religiously conservative time. So I think that it's the evangelicals recognized that the church was shrinking and they became more rigid, trying to equip their children to cling firmer to the faith. And unfortunately, that had the result of causing a backlash. And one of the bigger things that I've seen, and this brings us to our second example, is the YouTubers Rhett and Link. And I believe they are most famous. Actually, I don't want to say this because I don't remember exactly. But Rhett and Link are very famous YouTubers. Have you ever watched any of their stuff? They did Good Mythical Morning and a bunch of other YouTube shows.
Afraid not, no. Because this isn't a space that I'm usually, around online, so.
Yeah, they're definitely in the trendy and the top YouTuber type of content. And that was part of the problem. They got invited to all the VidCons and stuff, and they grew up as Christians and had a very conservative outlook. And when they were exposed to all these YouTubers, and YouTube is a fairly typical online space, which is, very atheist, very hostile to Christianity, and just people aren't around Christians. And actually, one thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is the Silicon Valley culture and how that's sort of affected the religious discourse, because I think you're much more familiar with that in some ways, and the impact of social media and the culture of the people who make social media on our culture. Would you agree that Silicon Valley in California has a distinct culture that's just not very connected or understanding of Christianity or Christians?
I mean, that's probably true in the object level sense that if you grow up in Silicon Valley and then imbibe a lot into Silicon Valley culture, you won't have a lot of connection. That's not exactly one that jives very much with traditional Christianity, which is say what evangelicals mostly believe in. I do think, however, that the trends of evangelical decline are much bigger than anything which happens in Silicon Valley or California specifically, because this is very much a national trend and affects people from a huge cross-section of evangelical families, people who come from evangelical traditions, because rise of a scientific or tech-oriented culture, that's the replacement culture that seems to be replacing traditional Christian culture. I would actually say it's more just a decline of faith in general, a more broad-based decline rather than something that's being brought about by, say, advent of new technologies or new scientific cultures or whatever.
That's really interesting, because I would say that it's a decline of faith in traditional institutions. There's still a lot of faith. I mean, one of the big things in California is there's a huge amount of belief in astrology. People will talk about those stupid fundamentalists, and then in the next breath talk about what their horoscope told them is going to happen to them.
Oh yeah, that's actually something that goes into something that I have a topic that I want to bring up here while we're here, which is that even though expressions of Christianity have declined a lot, it seems that the expression of some kind of religious belief or belief in some kind of higher powers or supernatural powers remains fairly constant. We find that globally, according to research on this topic, that in general, maybe about 85%, 80, 90% of people tend to have some belief in some kind of higher your spiritual or religious power, even if it's not specifically Christianity, or though in America that would have been most of the belief in the higher power for most of American history, and everybody else more or less naturally inclines towards atheism or just not having any strong beliefs in general. So that's something I would say is that if an inflation of decline of Christianity might be viewed less as a decline in spirituality or but more as you say, a loss of faith in traditional Christian institutions that's being brought about by some factor or other.
Well, I think it's a huge combination of factors that you can look at as, the perceived. Now, as a neocon, I'm not going to agree with this analysis, but the perceived failure of George W. Bush, who was very heavily identified as an evangelical Christian, the Catholic sexual abuse scandal in the early 2000s, and all these came at the same time and were very heavily marketed throughout the media and taken advantage of by the new atheist movement. The legalism, as I said, the really rules-based and rigid culture that a declining church sort of panicked and went into. And many more, but those are the big ones I can think of that happened in the early 2000s that kind of led to our current moment. And another thing is, with the rise of people that you regularly come into contact with who have no faith or have no defined faith, the whole spiritual but not religious phenomenon, which I think is sort of what you were talking about, comes this social peer pressure. Rhett and Link, in their Deconstruction, they did several long videos about this, said that they felt uncomfortable having strict principles about sex and marriage and drinking and drugs and the kinds of things that YouTube culture really gets into. So they were hanging out with all these people who they really respected as creators, and they put their value in that institution, the institution of their community in YouTube, which, as I still think that the Silicon Valley / Hollywood style culture that makes up most of the online influencer brand, I think it does have a bit more impact, partly because instead of just a bunch of people falling away or apostatizing, they now form their own communities. As I mentioned, there's a Reddit community called Exvangelical, which reinforces this. They spur each other on to be more aggressive, more firm in their rejection of Christianity. And if someone says, I'm really doubting whether, my atheism is real, whether my rejection of, you'll have all these people. It's kind of exactly what Christians are supposed to be doing in churches. If someone says, I'm really struggling with believing in God after the death of my child or something like that, you're supposed to have people coming alongside and saying, I'm with you, I've been in that place. If you have rival institutions being set up from a place that is very anti-Christian, I think that is going to reinforce more people leaving because they've got somewhere to go.
I feel
before that they were kind of lost.
I think that you make a very good point there about the development of rival institutions and basically if you need the church to be there in order to be a sort of like a rock that you have to cling to in order to for some kind of social stability, then that's going to be where you gravitate towards. But at the same time, if the development of rival institutions that fulfill the same purpose could easily lead to people abandoning those institutions when it no longer suits that purpose, as you say.
Yeah, a lot of the purpose of institutions like a church, although of course a good Christian would be able to connect all of the things that a church provides with, the central mission of the gospel or a relationship with Christ. Things like if your car breaks down, a church member coming and helping you, or if you lose your job, the church providing funds for you to keep living for a while, or if someone in your family dies, the church providing emotional and financial support during that period. A lot of those aren't directly connected to the explicit, Jesus died for your sins type of thing. And with the rise of a more welfare state-oriented position, and with other communities rising, the GoFundMes and, the online therapeutic type of communities like Slate Star Codex, for one, that's a very therapeutic style community that offers the same kind of benefits that like a small group of Christians who all are in each other's lives and know what's going on and are able to speak to each other. those various things replacing what a church did, detached from the explicit theological message, I do think has a real impact on whether people feel it's necessary, especially if their connections to various people in the church waver, or people move away or die. Or, as Rhett and Link did, they spend most of their time chasing the admiration of people who think what they grew up believing is stupid. Um, and I'm curious, are you able to say, were there specific beliefs that you really look at as key to why you believe you can no longer call yourself a Christian? Like specific doctrines.
So I think this is something. So I think this is something that's pretty interesting for you to bring up, because I bet this is something that I suspect is probably true for a lot of people. So say that they are very supportive of gay rights, but the evangelical church is not really a fan of gay marriage and that kind of stuff. So in that case, then you would face the prospective ex-evangelical would face a conflict between these two different value systems, and then say, hey, okay, I can only believe one of these, so I'm going to choose the other. So that's something that I suspect is probably a big factor, but it wasn't actually a big factor for me specifically. So I actually had specific theological disputes with traditional evangelicalism. For example, I could never quite resolve the fate unresolved. What happens to people who literally have never heard of Jesus in their entire lives, which would have been most people post him at 0, 80, and almost all of human history, even and history. Because Christianity was very much a regional religion until only a few hundred years ago, and then only recently became a truly global religion in the past couple hundred years. So that's a kind of moral dilemma that I was never able to quite get over with. But in general, I would say that there wasn't a point where I sat down one day and thought, okay, so I weigh up all the arguments for and all the arguments against, and then say, okay, the side is bigger, so now I'm not going to believe anymore. Really, it's more of a matter of at some point I realized my belief gradually declined over time, and so I started going to church less often, and then eventually I realized I didn't really believe anymore, so I stopped going permanently. And so even though I believe that there's these two separate sources of deconstructions, one of these being direct moral objections, and the other being having back of your head objections that just don't really get resolved, and as a result end up pushing someone out entirely. Really, in practice, my intuition is that most people don't directly and noisily apostatize. They just suddenly realize over time that they stopped believing and so stopped going. And so it's a bit of a harder nut to crack, because in that case, you would consider the source of the deconstruction to have been, and well, I guess I just would have been partly on the church as a failure as an institution that holds attraction to the current or former Christians, and rather than trying to win in a specific debate on certain points or such. So I think that this goes back to the point you were making earlier about institutional attraction. Does the church provide value to its followers as an institution, a default institution for resolving all of their various problems or needs in life?
Well, that brings me to a really interesting question, because, well, a pair of questions. So the first question is, do you think there was a point during your falling away that you would, you think someone reaching out from the church and having at least some kind of answer to those questions, or at the very least willing to explore those answers, do you think that might have changed your trajectory? And the second question is, do you see yourself in a stable place, or do you think you're probably still going to evolve, possibly going further away, possibly even coming back? Or do you think that you're kind of where you think you're going to be for a significant amount of time?
So in answer to your first question, I'd say that while there were, I wouldn't necessarily say that I didn't have any engagement at all with, say, counter-arguments to my own specific theological objections or such, because there was a time when I was very deeply devout and a serious believer, so it was not an easy even decision to eventually just leave the church. But eventually, after just some great deal of time wrestling with the basic theological points involved, I just felt I could no longer really agree with the substantive beliefs. And at that point, walking away suddenly became very easy. There were, in fact, conversations I had with my pastor and other members of the church on whether on the specific theological points, and as you can tell, I didn't really get an answer that wasn't exactly very compelling, so that did not exactly help either. But I wouldn't say that there was, just no convincing theological counter theological outreach. It was more just, in my particular case, I just never really even managed to convince myself of the default hypothesis that I originally had, which was that to accept Christianity versus the alternative, which is what I eventually went with. As to your second point, I would say that in general, you can't really, predict what's going to happen in the future, because I think something I wanted to emphasize very strongly during my time here is that even though I personally don't believe in Christianity per se, I view Christianity as an institution as having a very important, or having had a very important, extremely valuable social role. And I believe, and honestly, I think a lot of problems in American culture right now could be traced back to a decline in the predominance of religious belief, and the fact that even though people left the church, they didn't find an alternative anchor institution that would be as good a substitute for Christianity. And so this is a source of many problems, and people lacking reliable anchor institutions. And there's a bit more I could say about this, but and in some, I still believe a lot of the Christianity's basic diagnosis is about human problems. For example, human brokenness is something that I'm firmly convinced is very much the case. We are clearly broken people, and there are just a lot of imperfections that we cannot resolve on our own. But also, but not being able to accept Christianity's specific cure for the problem is a bit of a harder mountain issue to surmount. So, in that case, then the problem really goes down to, I know what the problem is, I don't really have a solution for it, and it would be not exactly honest or honorable to accept a solution that I was not, like, say, returning to the flock that I could not presumably convince myself was true. That would not be honest, and I wouldn't do that. And I think that would be respectful of Christianity as a religion either. With that having been said, I wanted to go a bit more on then topics such as the necessity for some kind of religious belief, which goes back to something I mentioned at the start of our discussion, which was most people, even if they don't really believe in Christianity per se, do believe in some kind of higher power, because it's something that people existentially need, or else they would be adrift without and be subject to a constant and a tidal wave of existential terror. And so, even though I really don't really believe in Christianity anymore, I find certain expressions of it very heartwarming. For example, Christopher Arnott has written about it as well, as he is also someone who doesn't really believe, but finds high value.
Author of Dignity, right?
Yes, that's correct.
An excellent book. I would definitely recommend it.
Yep. In religious institutions, in providing people that rock the anchor institution that as a solution to the almost universal human need for some kind of higher understanding beyond the physical world. He talks about how he has a high respect for Pentecostal churches because they answer this need in such a primal and basic way, and he even has skepticism, as do I, that if everybody were to take my path and apostatize and then have no anchor institution like the church, that America would be very much well served by it. So that's something that why, even though I even don't personally really believe much myself, I still believe that in the great importance of religion as an institution, because people need it, or else they're going to be adrift and mentally adrift and have difficulty resolving it, being their existential crises. And there will be no good solution to human brokenness that without such a similar institution. And I think that certain phenomena, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with like the term moralistic therapeutic deism, right?
The God is a vending machine that I put Christian tokens
Points
in and
into
get good stuff out of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And Pentecostalism, like no offense, is kind of a very MTD religion in itself because it's so primal, or it redounds to really raw emotionalism, and even though this is in the long term is certainly not a good long term solution because as sometimes you're going to put in coins and you're not going to get anything out because the bag of chips gets stuck, so to speak. And that's okay. That's something that traditional religious institutions, for example, Christianity, have a solution for, or but MTD type of religions really do not. So, so I feel like that the rise of alternative religious belief systems, for example, you mentioned astrology or horoscopes or such, is trying to fill that void with MTD type solutions, and simply what they're not cutting it. It's not the same thing.
Do you think that there could be some kind of either institution or group of institutions that are not based in any of the traditional religions that could rise to take its place in a healthy society? Well, specifically a healthy American society, since we're speaking from an American context.
Well, that's where my problem with my own set of beliefs comes from, and it's why I would definitely not rule out the possibility of someday eventually returning to the churches, because ultimately, even the churches have a very hard time seeing anything in the past 30 years which is fulfilling the same social role of the church, much less the spiritual fulfillment role of the church, and doing it as well as the church has. Like, clearly, these MTD institutions are not doing it very well at all, and to say nothing of people who have this fantasy that a government or ideology could perform the same role. Frankly, to judge from the tasks that from the performance of government and ideology in trying to be substitute churches, it's been a pretty god-awful experiment. Let's not keep on with this any further. In terms of what I think will happen, I think that it's important here to separate what I describe as the social necessity of the church and the spiritual necessity of the church with whether anyone actually believes that the foundational points are actually true or not. Because lots of people in America just simply also dispute the basic moral stances of the church and even the factual claims of the church. For example, if you accept Jesus as your savior, then you will get salvation. If you don't believe that, then there's no amount. Then it's not going. You can't really just pretend to believe it and then say, and then just try to use the church only for the social role. That's just not going to work.
Not long term, certainly. I know some people
No,
have tried
no,
it for a while, but it
no.
doesn't work.
Yeah, that's part of why I haven't returned yet. Because even though I think that the social role is very valuable, because I shouldn't return unless I truly have regenerated my belief.
Right. Yeah. I think that's very mature of you. And I really want to thank you for being so open and willing to talk about things that are very, close to your own experience.
I should add also that in regards to whether I think there will be any kind of mass return eventually, and whether there should be, because as you can tell, I think that we would benefit a lot from a mass return in general to some kind of universe widely accepted higher power power or a spiritual institution, because it would be better for almost everybody spiritually and socially, but not with whether I believe it will happen. Because actually, to be honest, I'm very skeptical about it, because the long-term position of major religious institutions in America, really globally, seems to be on the decline rather than the rise. It's very hard for me to see where to.
Well, I think that saying it globally is a little difficult. It's definitely fading
Well,
in the
true.
developed nations.
Oh yeah, in the West
In the
certainly, maybe not in the
developing nations, even in China, you have a lot of growth of the church. China, Africa, South America, there's still a lot of growth. And yes, in the more developed areas, it's definitely shrinking, sometimes alarmingly. But I think that it's difficult to say that it's fading globally.
Oh yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, it's true that religious belief is still very significant within developing countries. So that does make me wonder how much of the phenomena of deconstruction really can be chalked up to too much modernity. Maybe we're too advanced, so now we feel like we don't need it anymore, even though we
Too
probably
many
do.
dopamine hits from this Twitter.
Actually, yes, pretty
No,
much
I
that.
mean, I think that's actually a signal of cultural immaturity that I think really does contribute to a loss of institutional faith.
Yes. So As to whether there will be any kind of reverse or eventually, I feel that eventually, if when people are too spiritually unfulfilled, there will have to be some kind of reverse. It may not necessarily be Christianity; it might be a replacement religion, and just as Christianity was a replacement religion, and at the end
Well,
of
I know we've
the
talked a little bit about
first
how
century.
critical race theory borrows a lot of Christian theology in terms of, we have this original sin of racism and you have the gospel of anti racism. I mean, that's definitely trying to tap into the same meaning
Hmm.
itch that we've got. Now, I think
Oh
that
yeah, I
because it's
noticed that as.
intellectually bankrupt, it will fail, but it's definitely trying.
Oh yes, and Sam, what it certainly would. I think most critical race theorists wouldn't describe themselves in those terms. It definitely has that very similar feeling to it. I also think that due to intellectual bankruptcy, critical race theory is doomed to failure. But I would emphasize that another reason I think it's doomed to failure is because a lot of its basic tenets simply don't have one of the foundational strengths that Christianity had, which is that too much of it is just directly aimed at white people in general and men and cisgender people and so on and so forth, the bad categories. You can't. It doesn't seem possible you could possibly build some kind of new age religion based on such a blatant sectional division because if it's so blatantly sectional, then you would always have a large group of people who are going to be the out group, and you could never fully bring these people on board, and that will eventually cripple critical race theory as a viable replacement ideology. So in the long term, I think it will probably fail because I don't think very many people truly believe it the way people in the first century AD believed in Christianity, because Christianity had to grow organically. Critical race theory is being pushed in and from the top down, and
It's a
most
very
people
top
just
down movement. Yeah.
people. I would say that almost everybody I encounter, even if they agree with some of its premises, believe that the ideology as a whole is more or less BS. So in the long run, I think it will fail, but it will probably be a very ugly failing.
It'll take a lot of people down with it,
It'll take
unfortunately.
decades. Yeah, it'll take decades to try to
Well, and my,
win.
my real worry is that it's going to create exactly what it theoretically opposes. Currently, of course, there's racists. There's always racists, but I think that it's significantly less than 1% of the population. I think if critical race theory continues to gain power as it has, it's going to create a subset of white.
It could be something similar to the very racialized conflicts of the early 20th century, where eventually we step back from the direction and say, "Wow, that was really stupid. Why did we do all this?"
Yeah.
And then we have to figure out a way to climb out of it
Well, I hope we find a way to climb out of it sooner rather than later. As
without
a as a Christian
without
myself,
global
I definitely hope
conflagration.
that.
That would be terrible.
I mean, if you look at what happened with especially the Second World War, which uh, it's so ugly. What happens when racialization
It's
and
like,
tribalization takes over a government?
and then people, yeah. I
So that's about all I have planned. Do you have any last thoughts you want to share before we close out?
just thanks for hosting me. I think this was a very good discussion, and it definitely touches on some topics that I think are going to be of enduring interest within America, both in the short term and the long term.
Well, for our listeners, thank you so much for listening to Winston and I talk about Christian deconstruction. Please join our Discord, which will be linked in the show notes. We also have a Quora where we answer lots of questions. We're partnered with a Christian space that deals with a lot of questions like this. We're always open to conversation. And in fact, this conversation is largely based on multiple conversations that Winston and I have had on our Discord server. And if you have any topics that you'd like to discuss that you think would be relevant for a conservative and center right conservative perspective, please feel free to join us and message me and let me know. Or leave us a comment on the YouTube. Like, share, and subscribe to the videos, and we'll see you next time.